You are listening to Church Protect Podcast. Today we are excited to give a sampling of what people will receive at the Church Protect Institute. It's a subject close to our hearts. Why are churches not seeing the abusers in their midst, and how can we change that? So let's get started. Hey everybody, I'm Jimmy Hinton, co-founder of Church Protect Incorporated. I'm a full-time minister, husband, father of 3 wonderful children, and certification specialist with Grace. Welcome to Church Protect Podcast. I'm joined today by co-founder John Euler. John Euler has over 25 years working as a clinical therapist, working in a wide variety of settings, including outpatient settings, inpatient hospitals, and residential treatment settings. He has over 15 years experience working with both sexual abuse victims and seriously emotionally troubled teens, and 11 years working within a prison setting, during which he had treated thousands of sex offenders in both intensive and weekly therapy. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for coming. The Church Protect podcast is produced every week to help answer questions that we receive from you, the audience. You can find our podcast at churchprotect.org and our Facebook page, Church Protect Inc. Come back often and feel free to subscribe so you never miss a single episode. Now, let's get into the show. Well, welcome everybody to this week's podcast. I'm Jimmy Hinton, and over yonder is John Euler. Hello, John.
Hello, Jimmy. Always good to be together.
Yes, it is. We've been off a couple weeks, and we're back in the saddle, so to speak. So we're delighted to do it, and we're going to talk today in this episode about it's going to be a sampling of some of the things that we're going to be doing at Church Protect Institute. And we just want to talk about the importance of, just in significance of numbers, how many wolves there are inside of churches, and especially in church leadership. And the second component to that is how people don't see it. Very rarely do people see it. And then the third component to that is it's actually pretty easy to see them. It's easy to identify them. And those are the tools that we at Church Protect and specifically at Church Protect Institute want to pass on to the people who we train and teach you how to identify the wolves that are among us. So with that, John, I'm going to hand it over to you and just let you talk about some of the articles you and I were just talking about that you had posted on our Facebook page, which I thought were just excellent.
Yeah, people can go on our Facebook page, Church Protect Inc. That's different than our website. The website is churchprotect.org. That's actually the name of our organization. Church Protect Inc. on the Facebook page. They'll see 2 articles that we recently posted. One was on how many mayors across the U.S. have been accused of child sex-related crimes. That's a convenient way of putting it. They've been child molesters just over the past year to year and a half. And these are not small little podunk cities. So we noted on there that the typical profile that most people assume, the snatch and grab, the loner, socially inept, backward person lurking in the shadows, those are dangerous individuals. We all know of that, but that is the average person's idea and average churchgoer. We're looking for those strange, creepy guys to protect our kids against, as we should. But these are not the people that are going to have what we use the term high body counts in terms of victims. People that are unsophisticated are unsophisticated, and therefore they cannot do sophisticated crimes. Even if this wasn't a crime, it would still be morally reprehensible. But in the U.S., fortunately, still, when you molest a child, when you rape a child, it is a crime. And so the question is, what level of sophistication are we talking about that allows someone to perpetrate hundreds of crimes by the time they're busted? So that's what we're talking about. These are people that not only look normal, but these are above average, hence that article. Look at how many mayors have stepped down. Well, they're only stepping down for one reason. A second article that we put on the website has to do with the stash of pornography that was found on Osama bin Laden's computers, and that the government isn't going to release it, which is interesting. Why the heck wouldn't they release it? Wait, that makes me think also stuff I didn't even put on the website. And we laugh, but it's not funny. None of this is funny. But the question is this: what kind of secrets? That's interesting, and it fits. Part of the reason why I believe, Jimmy, we believe that churches are not more exercised, and when I say churches, it's church leadership and pastors, why they're not more exercised about this is, as James Dobson put it on a recent program, and he had a guest that heads up the National Coalition, I forget the agency name right now, but he worked with Dobson as a key staffer when Dobson was on Ed Meese's Attorney General Commission on pornography. And I think it's against sexual exploitation, child sexual exploitation, the agency on that. But they together were interviewed, and anybody can go back on Dobson's program and research that, but they're calling the issue of pornography a health issue, a societal health issue, because it's affecting at every level. But they're pretty convinced that between 50 to 60% of the men in any given congregation on any regular week are accessing pornography on a regular basis. That's the dirty little secret. So that would make sense why there's not a lot of men that are up in arms over this issue. And we need to sound a clarion call that people are being hurt. Kids are being hurt only because of this stuff. And so guys need to become men. They need to step up. They need to get their own house in order so that they can begin to do the right thing. Which brings us full circle back to, what is someone going to learn if they come to the Institute? That could be a great way to resolve, to begin to become the protector that a church leader needs to become. As a matter of fact, if a church leader is into some questionable stuff, we would still recommend they come to the Institute. We can help with issues of somebody who is dabbling or on a regular basis is into that. We can help them, and we can also help them at the same time get serious. We don't provide therapy, but we can certainly provide a forum for someone to get serious, come clean, and get serious about helping, because they need to understand that people are being injured, kids are being injured by perpetrators coming in the door, and they need to be able to identify these perpetrators. So we're going to look at, what is somebody going to receive if they come to the Church Protect Institute.
John, I thought something that stuck out in that article about bin Laden, as I read down through it, it said, there was a quote from somebody in the CIA, and they said, we just expect when we find terrorists, there's going to be pornography on their computers. And they said, there was a quote in there, and it said, 80% of the material on their hard drives is hardcore pornography. 80% of the material that's on their hard drives of every terrorist that they catch. That was not surprising, but it was really interesting to hear that statistic, that it's so prevalent, that pornography is, that it's not just that they're consuming it, it's that it's consuming them. You know, they're so engrossed in pornography, and like you said about bin Laden, they won't even release that. They're keeping that classified. His pornography is classified information, which leads you to ask the question, why is that classified? Except that the nature of the pornography is illegal. And, the type of illegal pornography is kiddie porn.
And maybe he's accessed that through various means. Maybe he has gained access to certain people's computers within the government. I don't know. It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
But which brings us full circle to why somebody needs to think seriously about coming and joining us at the Institute. Because the question is this: how well are you able to, quote unquote, profile someone that is so deviant that they would end up hurting a child? The idea about profiling has gotten a bad name. Jimmy, you and I were talking about that, but the Lord clearly indicated we had better profile. Profiling is not a bad thing. Political correctness co-opted the term racial profiling. We need to get rid of all these silly little political correct terms and get back to reality, which is this. If you're going to look for a wolf, you better know what a wolf looks like. In the military, back in World War II, if anybody has seen certain videos, either Pearl Harbor or other things, and they still do it, they had charts of the silhouettes of planes so that they could alert the primary bases of what planes were spotted. What is that? That is profiling of aircraft. So you had better be able to identify somebody by their fruits. Right now, the profiling that has been done is inadequate. As a matter of fact, it's dangerously inadequate because we're looking for the wrong thing. Anybody can identify a creep, right? Anybody can identify a disheveled individual that walks through the door of a church who looks strange. And it's not that it doesn't happen, but the moment that happens, everybody in the congregation notices and they're very uncomfortable. Not the predators we're talking about. Those are dangerous individuals, right? We're not minimizing that. But they will end up having one or two victims by the time they are caught. They'll probably have some more, and I'm not minimizing that. Those are the Amber Alerts. We're all concerned about that. That's a no-brainer. That's understood. Just like these mayors, there are levels of predators out there that are hunting and that are actively creating victims that it does not register an Amber Alert, but they're still sexual victims nonetheless. And so unless you know what you're looking for, and then unless you know how to deal with it, because the smarter these guys are, they're not going to be strangers by the time they are found out. For these 11 mayors, I can tell you from my work at the prison, the amount of evidence that it takes to convict someone of a sexual offense, the way these guys are so sophisticated, that if someone pleads guilty or steps down, you can only imagine how much evidence there is against them. So the threshold is so high legally that for every one perpetrator that goes to prison, I'm just going to guess, I don't even know, I would say thousands are never found out, or forget found out. Thousands are not held accountable. Because, and Jimmy, we hear this all the time, that the churches either try to turn a guy in or the perpetrator himself will go and turn himself in. But he knows, because no victims are willing to disclose, there's no evidence. And now that the victim is above the age of consent or over the age of 18, statutes of limitations and other things, if someone's not willing to stand up and cry foul, then the police can't do anything about it.
And the predators know that, and they use that.
That's right.
And that's, when they confess, and by the way, they don't voluntarily confess. It's when they get caught. What they'll do inevitably is they'll go back in time, and what they'll do is they'll act like they're agonizing over the fact that they victimized somebody. And John and I can write the script for this. It's typically just one victim, one incident with that one victim. And it was so many years ago that, my goodness, they can't even remember the victim's name. And they make it nearly impossible to get a conviction. And, we can't rely on convictions to stop these guys. And that's the whole point of what we do. Nobody's intervening. Nobody's intervening out there. Nobody knows how. And it's so easy to intervene. And that's the thing. It's not that complicated. And we make it so difficult. And, all the research that's out there now, it talks about red flag behavior. And once you identify this red flag behavior, we lay one option in front of people. And I'm not saying we at Church Protect, we give them all kinds of options. But I'm saying, generally speaking, we give people one option, and that's the only option that people feel like they have is to call what? Call police, law enforcement. And that only after you have met the threshold, which is reasonable suspicion. And so once you've met that threshold of reasonable suspicion, where you reasonably suspect that this person has already abused a child, then and only then can you call law enforcement, and that's your only option that we're giving people. That's nonsense.
And then they're stuck with the dilemma, and this is the most realistic dilemma, Jimmy, and churches and church leaders are not prepared. They have elected not to prepare. They think it's going to be an exception, or the exception rather than the norm. But now the guy is in the church. He's probably on staff. He hasn't been arrested. There aren't charges brought to bear. So now what do you do? Because the victim is probably in the congregation. So now you have, at the very least, quote unquote, an administrative challenge. Well, isn't that pathetic that we even call it that? But the question is, what's the church leadership going to do? And inevitably, Jimmy, we can't even think in terms of, how many churches. So it's 90%, 95% or higher. They'll do the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. They will do something very predictable. And it's disgusting, quite frankly, because they have no clue, because they haven't invested the time, effort, and energy into finding out the type of trauma that a sexual abuse survivor goes through. But they are going to make the wrong decision in favor of the perpetrator, because the perpetrator is manipulating and working this system in that church. So,
well, I think what you've dubbed that is just spot on, and it describes it perfectly. It's misplaced sympathies. I think you've described exactly what's going on, and survivors know it, and they feel it, and they experience it, and it eats them up inside. And I don't know. Inevitably, the question that you and I get asked is, when somebody finds out about somebody who's a known predator, this isn't even allegations, this is a known predator, the question inevitably is what? What can we do to wrap our arms around this brother and to support him? Inevitably, it's the wrong question, but that's the question that you and I are asked more often than not.
That's right. And that's the reason for the Institute. When we say people, we mean church leaders primarily, but anybody is welcome. We have somebody coming to the Institute that is not a church leader. She found out her husband's a perpetrator, and now he's doing time. So anybody is welcome. But church leaders especially need to understand, so that there are not misplaced sympathies, so that they do what the Lord wants them to do, so that they love justice, and they do justice and love mercy. They need to understand that by the time somebody becomes a perpetrator, they are not normal any longer, and they don't care about being normal. We don't like to think that, because our theology has become warped. The theology in seminaries now, in terms of practical application, we want to call it a doctrine of demons, that it creates misplaced sympathies. The church growth movement, and what's behind that, ultimately what's behind the church growth movement, is money. That's the only reason why someone would care about numeric growth in their church. Bottom line, there are some churches that need to be shredded in terms of numbers, because it's filled with Pharisees, and it's filled with black hole people and very, very dangerous people. The good people are dying on the inside, because they never step forward to shine the light on certain things going on in families. Forget just sexual perpetration. But instead of a pastor being willing to step up, do the hard thing, and see his paycheck go down, he will not, and he's going to actually give the audience what they want so that numerically the church grows. We have bought that lie that came out of Robert Schuller's philosophy, and one of his disciples was Bill Hybels of Willow Creek, and from that came Saddleback. And none of us like to name names, but we have to. And so the concept of the mega church, Joel Osteen is the natural byproduct of that. You know, the only thing good about that hurricane was the fact that Joel Osteen was finally exposed for exactly who he is. It's just a snake oil salesman. But none of us want to be discerning. None of us want to profile. So again, what is somebody going to get from the Institute? We're going to give you an example right now of how to profile, or what you're going to get in terms of being able to understand by the time there are what we call red flags. It's not what society calls red flags, but there are enough warning signs, and Jesus said you'll know them by their fruit. The very fact that someone gets into very deviant things, and by the time they are busted, they have gone through a progression, they've gone through stages. You're not going to hear this at any other training. Why? Because Jimmy and I have the background. We weren't looking to have this background, but we have the background. We've put our minds together and we've created this material. It hasn't been fun, but nobody else has the background that we do. There are a lot of folks doing trainings are legal minds. They're wonderful. We're glad that they're doing it, but they don't even understand the psyche and getting behind the eyes of it. Why? Because for them, fortunately, they haven't had to do that. They've worked on behalf of victims, which is a wonderful thing. So, for instance, using the idea of that recent article about bin Laden, and that the government is saying that about 80% of the material on those computers is hardcore porn, or even harder. Why shouldn't that surprise us? That seems strange. You have somebody that's hell-bent, as it were. He thinks he's heaven-bent, but he's hell-bent in destruction and destroying things. But what does terrorism and pornography have anything to do with one another? Because it has to do with the objectification of someone. That is psychobabble. That's a fancy little term that simply means this. Instead of loving people and using things, I now use people and love things. And I've gotten to a point, if I'm a terrorist, that I can view people as objects to be destroyed. If you can get to that point when it has to do with power, then you are at that point when it has to do with money, and therefore they justify. So you have religious people justifying graft and corruption. So there's money and power, and then you have the issue of sex. It all goes together. You will not find one without the other. And so with these mayors, what you're going to find is there's going to be financial graft and corruption, there's crony capitalism going on, and there's perversion. You're going to find within these types of leaders, and therefore within church leaders, you're going to find people that are not only into deviant stuff, but there's already warning signs about power and control issues. They will already be working all aspects of their lives and their quote-unquote ministries in a similar way. It'll start with, and think in terms of sexuality, most people can't conceptualize, most healthy people can't conceptualize having relations with someone where there's not an active, a meaningful relationship and an active participant. And I use that in a sterile term, spouse, where the spouse is not enjoying themselves, the spouse is not in the mood. That's on one end of the continuum. How do you get to the complete opposite, where you not only not care, very interested in creating trauma? You're very interested in enjoying the fact that this person's in pain. That's a complete continuum, and it's a stair-step fashion downward. Jimmy, did you want to add anything at this point?
I just that I completely agree with that. And that's at our symposium here in Kyla Speak, who was one of my dad's victims. She's now 17 years old. You know, she talked about how he not only tortured her, and John, you heard the way that she unpacked that and talked about, everything was a game with him.
That's right.
There was no question in his mind whether he was hurting her or not. And I think that's where psychology in the field of pedophilia, it lags way behind because they make the assumption that these guys just have these cognitive distortions and that they really think that the kids are enjoying it, when in fact, they know full well. The reality is they know full well that the kids are being traumatized, they're being terrorized, the kids are falling apart inside, and the abusers not only know it, they're using that, and they're playing games. It's all about mind control and toying with their emotions, and they're deriving pleasure from that. And Kyla made a statement that gave me chills when she said it, but she said, when I looked into John Hinton's eyes, she said, it was empty. It was empty and it was cold. And it's evil in its darkest form. And that's what people need to understand. And I lived with the man. And I can't overemphasize at all how kind and compassionate and caring he was as a father and as a spiritual mentor. But then when he was abusing kids, and that's the side of him it's just pure darkness and evil, and they know it.
That's right.
They know full well. They're fully aware of who they are, what they're doing, and they enjoy it.
And this is what people, especially church leaders, need to understand. Again, the reason why there are misplaced sympathies is they don't understand. They have not taken the time. On the one hand, understandably, because we're not taught this. But it still doesn't mitigate or remove our responsibility. We are to study to show ourselves approved. I think that's not just theologically, but if we're to be watchmen, if we're to be good shepherds, then we better be able to profile. And I need to be able to understand, as someone in a position of responsibility in protecting other people, when it talks about the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and pride of life. Those are different but parallel quantitative and qualitative dynamics going on at the same time. Those are three dynamics that the Lord used to describe. This is not this is not something that you can see on the surface, but eventually you can see the characteristics. So they have to understand that there are multiple things going on within the person at the same time. I'll just use a few. The issue of character is going on, the degree to which people are viewed as valuable, the degree of self-gratification, the degree of active interest in self, degree of decreasing degree of empathy and compassion, degree of forethought and intentionality, degrees of sociopathy and psychopathy. There's the modern terms these days. People want to debate with us, and it's beyond debate. We know what we're talking about. There's websites out there where people will ask, is a psychopath born? Is it nature or nurture? I can tell you definitively it's neither. Now, how can I be so sure? I'm trained in the PCLR. People want to sit there and debate with me, but I ask them, have you opened up a long-term intensive residential treatment program in solitary confinement for long-term worst of the worst inmates? I've got a lot of people that will enter into debates with me because they'll reference the brain scans. The brain scans show proclivity. We know what we're talking about. No other researcher out there can show definitively. These are researchers that do brain scans and interview guys outside of the bars. So a pastor needs to understand that Jesus knew what he was doing when he looked at Judas. And he said that it's better that this man wouldn't have been born, that this man was a devil. He was not calling Judas names. He knew what had transpired within Judas. And Judas was beyond hope. Judas was never going to change. Jesus chose Judas to fulfill Scripture. Judas always had a choice, but Judas was never, ever going to turn it around. And Judas showed certain signs. One of the greatest ones is when Judas finally had had enough, and he wants the money, and so he gets mad at Mary when Mary breaks the bottle of perfume, which meant she was done with her lifestyle. And Judas is disgusted. So he had objectified Mary, and he was angry because he had helped himself to the money bag. This was beyond reach and beyond hope. Modern theology will say, well, he always has a choice, or he always had a chance. No, he didn't. He had so hardened his heart that there was no choice. But Judas never got into child molesting. So these child molesters are even worse than Judas, in a way. Judas went to his own place, and I'm aware of that. This is very serious stuff, and you have to understand the multiple layers. So when it comes to the issue of misplaced sympathies, we cannot afford to do that because you will perpetrate yourself in a way. We will pile on, maybe that's a better way of putting it. We will pile on those that the Lord cares about, those that have been injured. We will add insult to injury if we do not do this properly. So people need to understand. Let me keep going just so they have a sense of what they're going to get. So we'll go into describing what is normal, healthy sexuality. As a person begins to become degraded in their character, they move from healthy sexuality, normal sexuality, where you care about someone, which is other-oriented, into quote-unquote recreational sex, friends with benefits, domestic partners, out of safety and convenience. There's an unwillingness to commit. So you can see a decreasing level of commitment, decreasing level of care and concern for the other person, especially with guys, quite frankly. The next level down is one-night hookups. That's different than a one-night stand. That's quote-unquote mutual agreement, no commitment, emotional detachment. You can start to see that there's a decreasing care and level of care and concern about the person on the inside by that time. Again, it's usually the guys that are going to recommend that. By the time somebody's doing one-night hookups, almost inevitably, they're into porn. They're also into quote-unquote single sex, which is a modern way of saying masturbation. So those two things are already going on under the surface. They also have separate bank accounts. So you have people living together. You can see there's a separation already going on. The next step downward is quote-unquote playing the field. That's a superficial level of commitment. Excuse me. With no intention of committing. That's covert and subtle manipulation, allowing the other person to get their hopes up. We're now moving further and further away from care and concern. Then you get into one-night stands where you have overt manipulation going on. Then it transitions into the beginning of the twisting process. Those are just relational oriented right there. Sorry. Can somebody see someone in that state, let alone by the time they start to become twisted? There's masturbation going on. There's even in that state, you have phone sex with another known person. It starts to get worse. Now it's with strangers or on Craigslist. Now it's 900 numbers. Now it's prostitution. Now you have sex bots. You can have a partner, and now that's a robot. If that doesn't tell someone, especially women, that a guy can compartmentalize and separate himself emotionally, he does not give up of himself through the physical. So as someone is becoming more and more inclined toward objectifying someone, again, using someone, other things are going on. Their level of self-gratification is going up. Spiritual darkness, that's the dirty little secret that people need to see. That's increasing. Things are starting to get a hold of this person. They're getting deviant. And there's an active level of participation. More forethought and effort is going into it. We're going to stop it here for virtue of time, but we haven't even gotten into the deviance yet. That's just socially acceptable. So by the time someone is busted, by the time a survivor comes forward, a victim comes forward, you need to, if you're a church leader, you need to understand this person who has, quote unquote, fallen into sin, it is not falling into sin. By the time somebody gets to this point, then, you know, it's not worth sympathy. So at that point, I'll let you really know how I feel about it, Jimmy.
I like it, okay. John. I like it. You're spot on.
Close us out here.
Spot on. So that'll give you a little bit of a taste of what we're going to be doing. And that's there will be 5 days of it. We have all kinds of materials that we've produced, and they're just going to keep coming. So we'll probably continue to do podcasts that just highlight some of the things that we're going to cover and make people aware. We get lots of questions about, what kind of curriculum do you have? What things are you covering? So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taste. We encourage you and invite you to subscribe to our podcast. You can do that via our website, churchprotect.org, or our Facebook page, Church Protect Inc. As always, we appreciate you, the listener, and we hope to see you and hear you next podcast. Thanks for joining us.